Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie. Welcome to the 1-year anniversary episode of How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. So right before we start, I'm going to announce a birthday giveaway. So as the podcast's 1-year birthday event, I'm going to give you presents. I'm giving away 5 copies of my books to individuals who leave or have already left a review for the podcast. The choice of the book is absolutely yours. So if you want to be in the draw for a copy of one of my books, leave a podcast review and take a screenshot and send it to me by email to support@nathaliehimmerich.com. Important, you need to take a screenshot of when you are writing the review, not just when it is posted. We'll need your reviews by latest June 24th, 8 p.m, wherever you are, and the winners will be announced on Monday, 26th of June, via my newsletter. So make sure you are signed up. You'll find all the links in the show notes. So today is, as I said, podcast's 1-year anniversary, and I am proud. I'm honestly very proud. I'm proud of all the guests that I got to interview, their vulnerability, their authenticity, their willingness to show up from a deep and authentic place of painful trauma and loss, and how they dealt with it or how they overcame it. It takes a lot of courage to be willing to speak about what has shattered your life. And it takes a lot of resilience to come to that place, to have the courage to speak about it. So for you listening, I hope that you receive the support you need to find the resilience and the courage through listening to other people's challenges, and that you take inspiration on how they have dealt with it, so that you can find your resilience in the inspiration that they bring, and that it gets you to see the hope within your own personal story of loss and trauma. Because in the end, it's always about hope for me. Hope is the middle name of my younger twin daughter who died almost 12 years ago. So for me, anything that I can do to bring hope is worth all that I do. I'm also proud of myself. As you know, this is an independently produced, edited and funded podcast. And if you want to support me, you can donate just $3 per month to cover some of the cost. And the link is simply bit.ly, so bit.ly link /supportgt podcast, like gin and tonic, but it's grief and trauma podcast. The link is also in the show notes. I'll repeat bit.ly /supportgt podcast. I'm so grateful for any person who can spare just a couple of dollars per month to help me fund this podcast and continue caring and sharing it without any advertising, if possible. You know, according to the podcast hosting companies, the average lifespan of a podcast such as this is 6 to 7 episodes. I was astonished when I read this, but honestly, if you look at Apple Podcast site, you'll find a lot of podcasts who just have a few episodes. So after those 6 or 7 episodes, people usually have realized the hard work it takes and have given up. They just stop. Now, this is episode number 44, and I think I absolutely deserve to be proud of myself. And today I have something really special for you. Today I'm going to be the one sitting across myself, so to speak, and answer the same questions as I've asked all my interviewees. If you've been here for a while, you probably have listened to episode number 12, where my ex-husband and I speak about the loss of our child. In that episode, we'll look back on 11 years since the loss. So you will have heard some of my story already, or you can go back and listen to that part in episode 12. But today I'm going to share a little bit more about my traumas and my losses in my life, and how they affected me, how they have shaped me, and how they have brought me to do what I'm doing in my life, such as this podcast, the Grief and Trauma Academy courses, and supporting individuals and couples with their losses and traumas. I've been thinking about finding someone to interview me about my personal story today on this 1-year anniversary, summer solstice. But honestly, I couldn't find a person that I felt right. The person that I would feel comfortable with to interview me as I interview others. I know it's a paradox. And I realized the position that my guests put themselves in and the trust that they place in me for bringing that container to them. It's really special for me to realize that. You know, Shelby Forsythia is one of my guests. I think it was episode 29. And she herself is a podcaster. And she called me a table setter. And she commented on the fact of how I take time to prep the space for my guests. You know, this is absolutely true, and it is so important in the topics of dealing with grief and trauma. It's absolutely pivotal to create a space where people feel safe, to actually want to speak about their stories. And this space needs to be set in the right way, and this is what I thrive to do for my guest. And for those of you listening, like you sitting here, for you to be ready to hear it. So today I set my own table and I set the table for you. So know that whenever you feel challenged or that it's getting too much, you can always press pause and come back to it later. So as much as I love being in conversation with my guests, and as you might have heard me speak in my first solo episode, number 40, I find speaking to myself quite challenging. And I noticed that even speaking about myself, and especially to an unknown or unseen listener, I find that even more challenging. Especially in conversation, I realized that I'm much rather ask questions than be just talking about myself. But today, I'm willing to go there. So let's start how I always start my podcasts, with the first question that I ask. How am I today? Well, to some degree, I feel excited to share with you my personal story in more details. And to some degree, I feel nervous. When I tune in, I feel a pit in my stomach like a ball. Because I don't know exactly what's going to come out. I don't know where my sharing will carry me emotionally, mentally. And I think it's actually a really good place to be in, given that my guests all put themselves into my hands and trust me to carefully, gently, and safely take them to all those places. And as you know, I always start with asking the question, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story of loss and trauma? So I'm taking a little bit of time now to share a little bit more about my different traumas and losses in my life. So if you've been a regular listener to the podcast, you will have heard me speak about my 2 most significant losses through death. So I lost my daughter, my younger twin daughter, almost 12 years ago. Her name is Amaya Merica Hope. And then my mother died from suicide, which was actually a follow-on from her depression 4.5 months later, so that's about 11.5 years ago. But today I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier in my life. I'm the youngest daughter of my parents, and even though people knowing me know that I have one older sister, most people actually don't know that we have another sister whom my mother miscarried. I think it was never actually spoken about, but I think I knew it before my mother died through some conversation. But I also don't really know how this affected her. I only know it from stories my father told me. I don't recall having spoken to her about it, which is interesting because Mom and I, we had a really close relationship. Even when I was living abroad for 15 years, she would call me and talk about things that I'm not sure to how many other people she spoke about. Also, numbers of occasions, we went on holidays, just the 2 of us. So, for example, when I was living in Singapore, we went to New Zealand together once for 3 weeks, and another time to Western Australia. And then when I would come home during the summer for a holiday, we would usually take a few days or a week together, and just the two of us. I think she wanted to make up for the time that she didn't have me around during the year. So it is interesting that I don't remember her ever speaking to me about her miscarriage and about her feelings. It could well be that I have forgotten, but I just don't know. But looking at me growing up and with the trainings in human psychology, I can clearly see that as much as my parents were doing the best that they could, there were also some obvious shortcomings which left traumatic imprint that I still deal with today. This I came to understand more clearly when I studied developmental trauma. Previously, I've always believed that trauma is only really a trauma if something really big, like such an accident or a war, famine, or like acts of terrorism or genocides, or some sort of violent attack happens. But these are actually like the big T I learned. But reflecting on my upbringing and the associated trauma, this brought some clarity with which all the previous modality that I spent years of training in, I did not achieve. You see, my mother was an emotionally very attuned woman, whereas my father, he wasn't. His pride as a father and the role that he saw himself in was to provide for a family financially and leaving the love and the care for the family to his wife. He actually said those words. When I was about 19, I remember it left me in such a shock that the words are etched in my memory. And there was also a friend there, which I then spoke later about that, and I just couldn't believe what he was saying. Basically, he said, "We had a clear agreement. I was there to bring in the money, and your mother was here for the love." I couldn't understand what he was saying, but looking back at my childhood, this makes a lot of sense. And it makes actually sense even more so today. But the relationship with my father is challenging to the point where a safe distance sometimes is the best way for us to relate. So with respect of him still being alive, I can only share as much as he was a choleric father whose reactions I feared. And as a result, I learned pretty quickly to read people's states and predict their emotional outbursts in an attempt to keep myself safe. For example, he would talk about something and me as a young child, I thought it was funny and I was laughing, and he would say, "This is not a joke." Or just the other way around, I wouldn't laugh at a joke that he made because I didn't get it. And he would tease me and say, "Oh, come on, this was a joke. Why aren't you laughing?" This instilled in me an everlasting doubt, feeling challenged to trust people or trust my impulses, or led to an avoidance of making decisions or trusting my emotions. So since early adulthood, I was fascinated by the human psychology and studied many different modalities. In the most recent years, I learned about shock and developmental trauma, which allowed me to put the puzzle pieces together and understand myself and my reaction in much broader light. So here's the next question that comes to my mind as I'm sitting here, that I would ask my guests. So in terms of losses, what kind of losses do I remember as a child? You know, I'm fascinated by interviewing my guests, the different losses that they remember. It makes me in turn remember some of the losses that I might have forgotten before. But in terms of my losses, in my childhood, there were a few that are non-death related losses that clearly stick to my memory. So one being the loss of my guinea pig. I really cared for my guinea pig. And the other one was the loss of a wallet that I had just received as a gift. So, and the interesting part about those non-death related losses isn't necessarily the loss itself, but the reaction of my surroundings, which I clearly remembered. And this is what I've learned about grieving. So with the guinea pig, when the guinea pig died, I remember my mom being there. And she was understanding of my sadness, and she was emotionally supportive. She allowed me to be sad. And with the loss of my wallet, both of my parents were there, but I remember my father's reaction which was he was scolding me for not having paid attention of where I had left it. So basically I went into a bathroom, I left a public bathroom, I took it off, left it there, and when I went back afterwards, it wasn't there. So again, my emotions were being dismissed. I mean, I understand it, but in retrospect, I see that my father wasn't able to deal with the emotions of a child, let alone his own, or first he wasn't able to deal with his own, so not that of a child. But he was able to react with his predominant way of reacting emotionally, which was anger. The next loss that comes to mind is the death of my grandmother on my father's side. I think she was the first person in the family that I remember that died. But this is interesting because when she died, it was the first time and probably one of the only times that I can remember my father being emotionally in tune with sadness. And as I wasn't used to this emotional reaction, seeing it in him, I was completely puzzled. I was confused. Just couldn't make sense of him being sad, of sadness itself already. I was okay. But next on the timeline is the death of my grandfather on my father's side. And so the interesting thing is my father and his father were estranged for a number of years. So we didn't develop a relationship with our grandfather as children. Only in the last couple of years of his life we went to see him once in a while, but it was too late to really feel any familiarity. And so the funeral, as I remember it, was a strange family occasion. The whole family was there, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles. And I think we were teenagers, probably I was about 13, and my cousins are mostly older. But I remember all that, it brings up just confusion. It was strange to see this sort of Italian side of the family to be emotional, whereas my father only knew him being strict and choleric. So next on the timeline would have to be my first boyfriends and relationship breakups. And with those relationship breakups, I would always go to either my girlfriends or sometimes maybe my mother. I mean, obviously they would know. But then when I was about 18 or 19, my beloved grandfather on my mother's side, who we had close contact with, he died while I was away on a holiday at that time, which was an interrail trip, which you could do in Europe, where you just take a train ticket for a month and you can have free rides on a train. And at that time, before the internet and before mobile phones, the only connection that we sort of had with home was that we would call once in a while to check in with home. And so I only learned from my grandfather's passing when it was already too late to return home to this funeral. And I remember I felt devastated and alone. I was actually staying in Denmark at my aunt's, so his other daughter, besides my mother's house with my cousins. But I was totally felt alone and isolated from my family, who were all together at the funeral, besides my cousins. And also, interestingly, I didn't get to see the other people's expression of grief in response to my grandfather's death. So my mother's side of the family, I didn't get to see that. So that's interesting. Because 10 years later, before my grandmother died, I came home from Singapore as she was critically ill. And I knew that I wanted to see her, and I wanted to make sure that I would see her before she would die. I mean, she was already in her 80s. But after visiting several times over the week that I was at home, I then returned to Singapore, and we could expect that she would die sooner or later. And at that moment, I felt I'm okay having said goodbye and having spent some time with her and her still recognizing me. And she, in fact, died within a couple of days of me leaving. But again, I wasn't able to attend the funeral with the rest of the family. So this was like a theme of me not being there when the rest of the family came together and grieved. So at this point, I would ask my guests, so how did I deal with the losses in my family, both as a young teenager and then early adulthood? You know, I don't have a lot of memories of how I dealt with it. As with the grandparents on my father's side, I said I wasn't very close. So I didn't feel a lot of grief. I mean, I could see my father's grief, but that confused me. Whereas with the grandparents on my mother's side, we were close. And so I was also older, and they affected me much more. I mean, especially with my grandmother, I felt I had a really great connection, and that was a big loss. But strange, it's sort of like a blank. What I do, however, clearly remember are the feelings of loss that I had from relationship breakups. I would call it that I was grieving out loud inside of me. I wasn't one to avoid or forget and move on to the next boyfriend easily. I sort of felt my grief and allowed the sadness, but only in private, only within my own old self. I wasn't really able to share that with a lot of people. But I also remember I didn't feel overwhelmed by it. I gave it space and time. Sometimes so much so that I remember one time a teenage friend of mine said, "Are you ever going to look at another guy again?" And so this was, looking back, of course I was, just not as soon as she thought or expected me to get over my last boyfriend. But I would say I had a lot of practice grieving. I think I had an affinity with being with people's pain and myself from a young age. Already as a young adult, I had people in my surroundings searching me out for emotional support and to counsel them. So something in me was fascinated with emotional intensity, with loss and death, so much so that one of my focus topics in my studies of applied psychology in Sydney was the topic of grief and loss. I was fascinated. I enjoyed that topic. But the kind of grief that I felt in my early life was in no comparison to the grief that I felt losing my daughter and my mother. I'm astonished, but as much there is only one word for grief, that experience after loss, there's such a magnitude of difference between those experiences. I mean, I can't compare them because I both felt them myself. I wouldn't want to compare my experience to someone else's. But in my experience, there's an absolute difference that doesn't even seem to justify the word grief to be used in both circumstances. I want to say something about comparison, which I said before in my episodes with some of my guests. There's an important thing that I want to say here, that comparisons are only ever useful if you want to compare your own losses. So to have an understanding of how they're different, not better or worse or more or less, but how you've experienced it in different ways. Because comparisons are not very sensible. To be used as comparing loss with someone else's, I want to say, or to say, I know how you feel. When my grandmother died, this was so and so. Because really, it's such an individual experience. For everyone, even for parents losing their child, the father has a different experience than the mother does, in any case. At the same time, this also applies to grieving. We might relate to another person's grieving experience, like often grieving parents can relate to other grieving parents' experiences, but this can be beneficial only in as much as to help us on our way of healing and integrating the loss in our lives. There's no other benefit to compare grief or to have like a grief marathon or Olympic thing where you say, okay, my grief is worse because the grief of a child is the worst. Well, we don't know. So what resources would have helped me? I would say that the common helpful resource element in all of my losses is talking to people. So the getting the understanding and the support and the validation of my personal experience. I would say I was both lucky but also clear as to who I chose to be willing to be sharing with and getting the support. And this is pivotal. Of course, I received also a lot of unsolicited advice, or I had people telling me what to do, things to do that were absolutely not supportive nor helpful. But this in itself was helpful to me to become clear as to what is it that I need. And I have been hearing it from so many clients that I have created a whole list of helpful and unhelpful comments and suggestions that they would have loved to receive. Because the quality of support and the support people is what determines the potential of healing. In fact, my latest book, Bridging the Grief Gap, is all about the topic of support. And I can highly recommend it for anyone who wants to be a good quality supporter or who wants to find out how to best be supported in their personal journey with grief and loss. And looking back over the year of podcasting, this has been by far the most mentioned resource, support. Support of high quality, but not necessarily quantity. The next question that I would ask is probably what kind of traumas would I say I've experienced beside my developmental trauma? So there are a few that I can think of, like medical traumas, operations that I had, medical impact of me that was very highly sensitive. This was intense. The dentist in itself, as a child, I remember being very fearful. There was many things that are considered trauma. But one of the most significant traumas is, I would say, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. I think I've mentioned it in my episode 42 with Janet, but I haven't really taken the time to fully share my personal experience. So let's see how much I feel like sharing today, as this experience has completely shattered a part of myself, and it took me years of personal work to deal with it. Now, I won't go into details, as I do not find it helpful to retell the story and re-traumatize myself. Neither will it help the listener who might have been subject or a victim of sexual abuse or be hearing the details of my personal story. This is not helpful. But basically, just to keep it short, I was a massage client where the male masseur sexually abused me. Just even this sentence makes me sick to my stomach. So I will go to the part of answering the question of what actually helped me to get past this. There's no way around it. I had a lot of therapy sessions, both psychological as well as physical therapy. And I went to see a lawyer who was offered by a center supporting women after sexual assault, who helped me deal with the court case. Looking back, I think it's absolutely pivotal to go to people that know what they're dealing with, not just any person or any therapist. I really, really recommend that you find someone that is trained in that specific area. What still shocks me to this day is the absolute unpreparedness I had for such an event and the amount of time and resources it took me to heal. I find it still flabbergasting. So if you are listening to this because one of your trauma is of sexual nature, like a sexual assault or domestic violence, please search for support or people or centers that are equipped to deal with those situations. And if by any chance your experience was not validated, do seek again, go elsewhere, do not give up. So how has my loss and trauma shaped me? Looking back, I shared already a little bit, but I see the effect of all of these different traumas and losses that they have on me, physically, mentally, emotionally. I'm definitely not as resilient as I was before. I'm even more highly sensitive as I ever been. And there has been like this basic trust in human nature that has been shattered to some degree, and that I haven't been able to fully build up, and maybe it never will. For example, the other day I was at the dentist, and I just realized that I had been traumatized by the previous visit to the dental hygienist, where her dentist wanted to try out a new tool he had, to which I naively said yes. So I noticed that my dentist, which I'm used to and which I trust, when he put the tools into my mouth to fill a hole, it did not take much more than a couple of times someone opening the door and asking something, and I was in fight or flight mode. My body was reacting even though my mind was fine with the dentist that I trusted. And luckily, my dentist reacted positively. He asked me if everything was fine, if he should stop, and I was able to take care of myself and my nervous system regulation. And then I told him that I just felt overstimulated by the noise and by the people entering the room. And so for my next dentist visit, I have already decided to ask them to have no one enter the room. Because I already know that just being in a dentist chair, having a hole fixed, is enough for my nervous system to deal with. Like this is the self-care that I need in regard to visiting the dentist, as an example here. So, I think that's a good place to end this with the rapid fire questions that I ask all my guests. Grieving and trauma means devastation, loss of naivety, and also the chance to create meaning and purpose. Healing means integrating loss into life and taking self-care and my own nervous system health as a top priority in life. In the light of loss and trauma, I have learned that I have resilience even if I don't believe I do, or if I can't see it in a moment, and that I can heal and integrate the loss with time and tenacity. That has been clearly shown to me in the last 12 years. And one thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma is that there is hope, even if or when one cannot see it. And most of all, get support. Get someone who is just a few steps ahead of you. You know, we are made to grieve, but to have someone hold our hand in this is so helpful. One specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss. You know, I had a hard time finding something, but actually the depth of empathy and understanding of people's pain, including my own, and the potential that every person has to rise from the ashes and rise up again. So thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is the last episode for season 4, and we're actually going into a summer break and starting again a little bit later. I haven't fully decided when, but there's a couple of guests that await you for season 5. I have already started recording. There's amazing people coming up, a Harvard professor, a few therapists that are actually sharing their specific therapy that can help deal with grief and trauma, one of them being ART, one of them being EMDR, internal family systems. There's many things that have been named in the last year that have been beneficial for people, and we're actually going to speak to the people who know and use this form of therapy, or maybe have actually even invented it. So look forward to season 5, stay tuned, and make sure to enter the giveaway. I look forward to hearing your feedback. As I said, podcast is a very lonely experience here, and I would love to receive your feedback. You can always just send me an email or write a comment on my website on the show notes for every episode. Thank you and take care. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.